in Jerusalem in the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design. I'll tell you a little story today, story about type, about history and sources of inspiration, and also about type as an expression for an ideology. My talk will deal with the history of the Hebrew letter, and more specifically with a certain time, a specific decade, the first decade of the State of Israel, the 1950s. This was a time in which the Hebrew letter that was lost, was completely stuck, frozen for many centuries, was finally found and revived. In short, it's a story, I think, I hope, a fascinating one, about the past, the present, and possibly the future, and again, as type, it's about type as an expression for ideology. But first of all, assuming that most of you are not familiar with the Hebrew script, I'll go quickly and do a quick preview or introduction for the Hebrew script. Modern Hebrew consists of 22 letters, 5 of which have final alternate forms. The script is read from right to left, and it has no uppercase letters. It's a monocase script, and also we don't have any other typographic tools. We don't have italics nor small caps. It's a rather limited typographical set. There are 5 descenders and 1 ascender in Hebrew, but compared to the Latin script, they occur not that often. Hebrew is usually thought of as a horizontal stress script. With modern or contemporary sans serifs, it's a bit different. Sometimes you find a vertical stress or no stress at all, but usually the classical version, the classical Hebrew, is a horizontal stress script. There are 3 different hands or styles in Hebrew. This is the formal, what is we still call the square Hebrew. It is used for book setting, and this is the official book style. This is the same thing in the sans serif version. And then we have this, which is a semi-cursive. This is quite rare, and it's used only for rabbinical commentaries, so it's not seen that much. And the cursive flowing hand. This is the handwriting used for correspondence, everyday writing, etc. You can see that they are rather different one from the other. Some historical background. Since the creation of the first Hebrew letter in print in 1475 in Italy, and until the dawn of the 20th century, all Hebrew typefaces were clearly based on the calligraphic styles found in the manuscripts of medieval Europe. And this was the only source of inspiration. The 2 prevalent styles seen in Europe since the 12th century, roughly, were the Ashkenazic, which you see now, mainly developed in Northern Europe, northern France and Germany, and the Sephardic, mostly seen in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Generally speaking, by the way, this is the style that influenced most Old Hebrew typography later on. So we have 2 styles, basically both medieval. On the right hand side, the Ashkenazic, and on the bottom, the south, the southern style is the Sephardic. Up until the end of the 19th century, Hebrew was a dead language. It was used solely, and I'm talking about the language now, not the script. It was used solely for religious and ritual texts, and therefore it froze and got stagnated. As a consequence, the Hebrew letter, the visual form of the language, was preserved with no significant changes all along those many centuries. Most of the typefaces designed try to imitate manuscript calligraphic styles, but as opposed to the transition that happened with the Latin letter, in Hebrew one cannot trace any traces or phases of standardization, regularization, gradual improvement and refinement of the form of the letter. On the contrary, many Hebrew typefaces were based on poor writing styles, extremely contrasted, like the one you see here, and very hard to read. Others suffered from severe letter differentiation problems, which are in any case a problem in Hebrew. So the conversion of these poor manuscript styles to movable metal type preserved and actually fixated inferior quality standards. It was not until the first decade of the 20th century that the Hebrew script began its new way, its new adventurous voyage. At this stage, the script surely needed a reform, it needed a renaissance, a rebirth. There were few reasons for the increasing need for new and more secular Hebrew types. The rise of the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century, the revival of the Hebrew language, slowly becoming a living language again, used for secular, mundane, everyday texts, and in general, the Jewish society becoming less and less religious. All those resulted in the printing of more secular, everyday texts, and this in turn made clear or evident the need for earthly secular types. If you're asking yourself who's the guy on the stamp, that's the Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was the visionary and driving spirit behind the revival of the Hebrew language. He kind of invented the Hebrew language again in modern times. A quick word about Zionism, without going into politics. I assure you I won't say anything about politics. Zionism is a form of nationalism of Jews and Jewish culture that supports the Jewish nation state in the territory defined as the land of Israel. This book, Alt Neuland, was the utopian novel written by the founder of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, in 1902. In this book he depicted his vision of the future Jewish state in the land of Israel, or about to be born in the land of Israel, and of the Jewish people returning to its homeland. This type, the Frank Rule type, created by Jewish cantor Raphael Frank and the type founder Rule in Leipzig around 1908. That was the type, or this is the type that first liberated Hebrew script from the problems and the shortcomings of the past. In spite of it has kind of an Art Nouveau style, a bit wobbly, but nevertheless this type had better proportions than before, better letter differentiation, and reduced contrasts. I should mention that this type is the most popular Hebrew typeface to date, more than 100 years after that. From the 1920s to the 1950s, two parallel tracks can be recognized in the development of Hebrew type design. On one hand, we have the reviving of manuscript medieval styles. Again, the base for this is the Sephardic medieval style. And on the other hand, geometric sans serif, simple, no ornaments, simplified, clearly influenced by modernist European movements such as the Stil and the Bauhaus. So there are those two styles evolving or being developed from the 20s to the 50s. I should mention here and stress that there was just a small handful number of types created during that time. So I'm really talking about 2 or 3 different typefaces created during a few decades. In 1948, the State of Israel was founded, and it was during the 50s that the state institutions were established and the country saw rapid growth in economics, in business, in industry, and in population, of course. And the printing industry produced more Hebrew newspapers, books, ephemera, and as such. New type was needed. It was needed for those this printing, the printing of books, newspapers, and advertisement, but mostly, I believe, it was needed for something else. The type was needed as an expression of the rebirth and the reconnection of the Jewish people to its homeland and origins. It was an expression of some kind, like think of a bridge between biblical era and the modern state of Israel. And so, after the publishing of only one single typeface during the preceding 20 years, as I mentioned before, 5 new and innovative typefaces were released during just 4 years, from 1954 to 1958, all in Jerusalem. Those are the typefaces, and all these 5 are considered today as some of the best and most legible Hebrew typefaces, or modern Hebrew typefaces we have. To a large extent, one could say that these typefaces created the modern Hebrew canonical type forms. These were definitely the formative years of modern Hebrew type design. I should mention that 3 of those 5 started, the development of the design started before, but the design matured, and conditions were set, and the release of all those 5 happened, as I said, in between 54 to 58. Tzvi Narkis, the renowned Israeli type designer, and in my view the most important type designer, Hebrew type designer of modern times, he wrote that he saw the release of 4 new Hebrew typefaces, the typefaces I have showed you, during just a few years. He saw this as one of the most important events of the history of Hebrew typography. Type design and calligraphy during those years were highly influenced by extensive archaeological excavations in Israel. New, unknown shapes of very old letter forms were revealed in such findings as mosaic, as the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated from the 3rd century before Christ. And by the way, the scrolls were found here in the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea, and this is about a half-an-hour drive from the academy where I teach. And more new letter forms were found in burial inscriptions, in sarcophagi, in mosaic lettering, all from ancient times. This is another example, another one. The findings, those excavations and findings, were more than anything they looked for proof for the historical bridge between the biblical era and the modern state of Israel. Henry Friedlander, a renowned Hebrew type designer, who is, by the way, very well known in the Netherlands. He was working in Holland after the war. And he said, and I quote, "Archaeological and similar activities have yielded many specimens of antique lettering, giving us an insight into the basic shapes and the way they have subsequently developed. As a result, lettering from the 1st century BC until the 6th century AD has become alive and is now strongly influencing our calligraphy." What you see here is the official Independence, the formal official Independence Day poster for the 10th anniversary of the state. And as you can see, the main image of the poster celebrating the first decade of the state is mosaic excavations. And needless to say, all the lettering on the poster is based and relates to those ancient times type forms. All those historical influences obviously started influencing initially in lettering and stone carving work and sign painting, and gradually started influencing and had an effect on the design of the printed letter. So those 3 typefaces were unmistakably influenced by those ancient type forms. The designers of those typefaces all looked back beyond Middle Ages to ancient times and took their inspirations there for the creation of new typographic forms. I want to show you a few specific letters, a few samples that can illustrate this influence. This is HaTzvi, which is a simplified monolinear typeface, and it was designed by Moshe Spitzer and Zvi Hausmann and released in 1956. It has two interesting features, or characteristics. One is the replacement of the traditional instrokes on the upper bar, the horizontal bar of the Hebrew, the replacement of those instrokes by this broken angular stroke pointing upwards here. And the other thing is the relationship of this typeface with calligraphy. You can notice this reminiscence of movement in some of the letters, like here, and here, and here. But the most interesting feature of this typeface is, again, its inspirational model. Let's take a look at this letter, the Dalet, and on the left-hand side you see it in HaTzvi. If we and let's focus on this detail, on this tail pointing upwards. If we look at the medieval models, you can clearly see that you don't have this detail there on the right-hand side. But if we look at the ancient times model, you clearly see this detail there. So there's absolutely no question there about what the designer was looking at, or which models. Yeah, you see it here. And if we take another letter, the Kuf, again from the same typeface, compare it, look at this part here, and you see that it's two strokes connected. And again, if we look at the medieval examples, you see that the two strokes are disconnected. Again, ancient times models show us this model. If we look at the second typeface, David, it's a clearly calligraphic typeface, and Ismar David, the designer, he clearly aimed at innovation. He wanted to create something new, different, and yet related to tradition. In a letter he wrote to architect Eric Mendelssohn, he wrote, "As a contemporary artist, I have tried to retain the strength, beauty, and simplicity of Hebrew traditional design, but to strip it of the tasteless superfluities which have sometimes been added." While observing the history of the Hebrew letter, David clearly chose a new track. He was inspired by other forms that all those those that influenced type designers until then. He wrote, and again I quote, "When I decided to venture into type design of Hebrew characters, it was clear to me that these designs would have to be much closer to classical Oriental Hebrew than the typefaces that had developed in Europe. What I set out to do was bring basic forms closer to true old Semitic forms." So it was a clear intention. He was well aware of what he was doing. And well, those are details, interesting details of the typeface, but I will run through it. And again, if we look at one letter here, the Dalet, you see this cross detail of the two strokes. Looking at medieval models, you don't have them there, you don't have it there, and again, here exists. Narkis block, which is the third and last typeface I will show you, was released in 1958, designed by Tzvi Narkis, and it's a well, you can see it's a simple, simplified sans serif typeface, and as Narkis himself wrote, it's based on simple geometrical shapes, and was inspired by stone-carved letters found in sarcophagi inscriptions and in many mosaic lettering, revealed in ancient synagogues and in other archaeological sites throughout the country. And again, if we take a look at this letter, for example, the Lamed, and compare it to the Lamed we saw previously, to this one or this one, you see in both cases that the influence is clear. Also, if we take a look at this letter, the Shin, you see that the middle stroke is connected to the left one. And this is, today, it's a very common model for this letter, for the Shin. And again, we can notice it in those ancient time models. Okay, so we talk about this. But if we go back to medieval samples, like the Ashkenazic here and the Sephardic here, you see that the middle stroke is connected to the bottom part of the letter. So to conclude what I'm trying to say, I mean, by the way, this is the specimen, the original type specimen, the announcement brochure for this typeface Hatzvi, and the title is Hatzvi, a new Hebrew letter. So what I was trying to tell you with this little historical story is that the typefaces shown here are most popular, or some of the most popular Hebrew typefaces nowadays. They're all considered very legible, easy to read, and none of their letter forms are obtrusive or odd. They are what we are used to read, and they are very common in Israel. Yet, when they were introduced in the 1950s, some of those letter forms, those really root forms, as shown here, as I've shown you, were a complete innovation. It was a complete novelty. To a certain extent, one could state that these typefaces really changed the formal convention of the modern Hebrew letter. It is this combination of the old and new, the definition of new ground for inspiration, for exploration, for a new model, and the distilling and capturing and looking for the real essence of the Hebrew letter that makes these or those typefaces really revolutionary. And I'm trying to keep this story as something. Well, it's a story I'm telling my students, and something that I'm trying to tell myself when designing. And this is it for today. I hope it was interesting. Thank you.
All right, does anyone have any questions? Thanks, that was very interesting. I was just wondering if you knew about typefaces, Hebrew typefaces that were made for the linotype or for the monotype, and whether they were popular and why not, and also if you know, or if you could tell us what machines those 4 or 5 revolutionary typefaces were made for.
Well, there were a lot of typefaces. Well, not a lot, because there were not a lot of Hebrew typefaces at the time, but actually there were quite a few that were made for monotype and linotype. And the typefaces I've shown you here, I think all of them at some point were made for those machines.
So initially conceived, were they for foundry type?
For hand setting, yeah. Initially I think they were all made initially for hand setting, and then transformed into machine setting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I saw a hand. Oh, sorry.
I have a question concerning the contrast in Hebrew faces. Usually we have bold horizontal lines and smaller verticals. Is that right for modern sans serif typefaces also?
Well, generally speaking, yes. As I mentioned before, for what is which is called serif Hebrew, which is not really a serif, but
sure, yeah.
Just to use it as a term for serif types, they are usually or almost always like this. That means that horizontal stress, and the thicks are on the horizontal dimension.
Yeah.
But with modern or contemporary sans serifs, you see more and more, or more, actually most of them are the opposite way around.
Like the Latin faces.
Yes, and it's a good question. It's a good issue to deal with and to think about and to consider. perhaps do it the other way around. For now, the convention is that sans serifs are like Latin, like with a vertical stress.
Could you try to explain which kind of writing implements were used through history and how that may have shaped the letter forms?
Well, it's a big question, but in general, I think that if I understand well your question, the tools, the writing tools were similar to the writing tools used to write Latin. You should remember that, well, at least during the Middle Ages, the Jews were living in Europe in Christian or close to Christian communities, and scribes were using probably similar tools. The direction is different, the angle you hold the tool is different, but in general you can find things or manuscripts that are written with brush or broad-nib tools for Hebrew, as well as like similarly to what happens with Latin.
So there hasn't been found any sort of archaeological evidence showing that, for instance, they were using cut reeds in ancient times for Hebrew, or?
No, also in ancient times, I don't think there was a specific tool that you can identify with Hebrew as opposed to other scripts. The tools were similar. Some of the samples, well, what I've shown you today was mostly found in archaeological excavations. So most of it is carving, is stone carving or mosaic lettering. What you saw on the scrolls, what is called the Dead Sea Scrolls, is on parchment, or I think it's parchment, or leather, and then it's a kind of it's not a broad nib there. It has no stress, or almost no stress at all, on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Sorry, but the Hebrew language was founded during writing the Bible, from 1000 before to about Christ.
Yes,
so that time it was written on paper, right?
But it wasn't paper; it was parchment or leather, or yes. But the Hebrew letter, what we call the Hebrew script, what we know now as the Hebrew script. The earliest samples we have are from the 3rd century before Christ. Those are the earliest samples we have. What was before that is what is called Old Jewish script, which is different. It's totally different. It's a different script, which was used to set or to write the language, but it's a different, totally different script, which I cannot read, for example. It's different.
Has there been much influence of Latin typography on Hebrew because of bilingual setting recently? I suppose many scripts suffer because of this.
Yes, suffer is the right term for that. Yes, there was actually, situation now is much better than it was a decade ago, due to more and more type designers working, more and more type designers are aware to this problem of Latinization. A decade ago you can found really, I would say maybe hundreds of Latinized Hebrew typefaces, mostly used for display, but with a lot of deformations and reversed stress and many problems. Some of them are really like cut and paste typefaces taken from Latin well-known typefaces and kind of mix and match and made new Hebrew typefaces. Nowadays, I think we're over that, I hope. And in most cases, young type designers or the type community in Israel understands the issue and everyone is trying to look for other models rather than the Latin, and look at history and try to find proper models for Hebrew.
And are there any interesting developments recently? I mean, typefaces that you use for continuous text. I mean, is there a lot done in Israel?
No, for continuous text or again what I would call for this matter serif Hebrew typeface. Typefaces are quite rare. There are not many of them done. There are more than in the past. I would guess that in the last decade, few dozens were designed and released. Nevertheless, they are not very popular. I mean, the typefaces I've shown you here, designed 60 years ago, are more popular than most, or I would say all contemporary Hebrew text types. This is not the situation for sans serifs. With the sans serifs, there are quite a lot of types used, but for the continuous reading, like again what we call Latin text typography, it's still a problem. And as I mentioned, the Frank Rule type, which was designed more than 100 years ago, is still the most popular Hebrew typeface. And by far, it's more popular, and you see it all over. I mean, I would guess that 95% of Hebrew books are set with this typeface. So this is the situation.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
I'm very